pleasant morning, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual classroom. I hope you're doing just fine. This is another video lecture in Unit 1, Chapter 5. This is the final chapter of the lessons for Unit 1. Before we start the lesson, make sure that you're ready and are comfortable wherever you chose to sit or stay. Please take note of the important points that will be covered throughout the lecture. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in class or send a personal message on Facebook. In our previous lesson, we identified some of the major challenges that adolescents such as yourselves experience. Today, we will continue talking about them, and we will also be looking at ways on how and what people usually do to respond to these challenges, and what are healthy ways to understand and respond to them. First, we'll focus on one major challenge that adolescents constantly experience: socio emotional challenges. This will be followed by self awareness and meeting life challenges, defense mechanisms, Adler's way of meeting challenges, and expressing one's feelings about others' expectations. Now, let's look at our lesson objectives. At the end of the class, you can discuss that facing the challenges during adolescence may be able to clarify and manage the demand for teenage years. Express your feelings on the expectations of the significant people around you and make affirmations that help one become more lovable and capable as an adolescent. Before we begin the lesson, let's do a brush up on the concepts we've covered in the previous lesson. We will be doing a quiz bee. I hope you're ready. So, welcome to the ultimate personal development quiz show brought to you by our lovely and generous sponsors, LBC and Glade. So, the mechanics of the game is very simple. You will be asked 10 questions about the previous lesson. Try to answer after the buzz. You may either write your answer on a sheet of paper or have a mental note. Each correct score is worth 5 points. If you get all the right answers, that simply means you remember them and that's good. Are you ready? Let's get the ball rolling. Question number 1. Developing a good self esteem is usually the most challenging task for a teenager. Your choices are true or false. Time is up. The correct answer is true. I hope you get that right. Moving on. Question number 2. Low self esteem does not affect the adult. Your choices are true or false. Time's up. The correct answer is it's false. Let's move on to the third question. To develop a healthy self esteem, one needs to see both one's assets and limitations. Your choices are true or false. The correct answer is true. I hope you got that one right. Let's move on to the next slide. Self acceptance only happens when a person can see him or herself liked by others. Your choices are true or false. The correct answer is false. Let's go ahead and see the next question. How does media portray self image? Your choices are A. Unrealistically through perfectly shaped models. B. Realistically by showing how people really look. C. Achievable as TV figures look just like anyone. And letter D. Immorally because celebrities live a sad life. The correct answer is A. Let's move on to the next question. How should one understand what's best for his or her body? Your choices are A. By copying whatever is shown in TV. B. By stressing oneself out and having self pity. C. By understanding his or her body type. And D. By forgetting that diet is important. The correct answer is C. By understanding his or her body type. Moving on, what does peer pressure bring to friendship? Your choices are A. A sense of belongingness. B. Tight and unbreakable bond. C. Unnecessary source of stress. Or D. Meaningless and dangerous agreements. The correct answer is C and D. Moving on to the next question. Adolescents have the strongly felt need to find a group to belong to and fit well in. Your choices are true or false. The correct answer is true. Let's see the next question. Okay, I think you need some really a lot of time to prepare for this. Give the 8 common types of challenges adolescents experience. Okay, your time is up. Let's see if you got all the right answers. First, self esteem, physical appearance, group belongingness, relationships, sexuality and sexual relationships, academic concerns, choosing the right course and career path, and finally, socio emotional challenges. Okay, that wraps up our quiz bee. How many points did you get? I hope you all got the right answers. Now that we've recalled the concepts, let's continue our discussion with our case study. Let's begin our discussion with a case study. Jean and coping with grief. Jean, 16 years old, had become noticeably withdrawn from both family and friends in the past several months after the death of her younger brother. Since then, she had become less interested in her appearance. Jean stopped participating in her church's youth group and her grades dropped at school. She was moody and had become pessimistic in her outlook toward life. She developed a short fuse and complained of feeling worthless. Recently, friends reported that they had seen Jean drinking with a group of older students after school. Jean had been very close to her younger brother and appeared to have been the most affected by and least accepting of his death. Now, uh, Jean's situation might sound very familiar to you or to someone you really know. Going through this difficult situation could be a true struggle. In Jean's situation, we saw that Jean has changed and this tragedy truly affected her. In order to understand Jean's situation, I'd like you to read and answer these questions. You can pause the video to think of your responses. So remember that grief affects a person in many ways, and it can be speculated that perhaps the death of Jean's younger brother has negatively affected Jean's emotions to the point that she has changed in all aspects of herself. As she experiences grieving over her younger brother's death, Jean's desire to maintain social relationships decreased, as well as her self esteem, sense of responsibility, and her desire to take care of her body and physical appearance. Other socio emotional struggles include anxiety, depression, bipolar disorders, trauma, eating disorders, substance abuse, and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Brief descriptions of these mental disorders follows. We begin with anxiety. Anxiety is the sense of impending doom without factual basis. The anxious person tends to be apprehensive, irritable, full of fears, and lacks confidence. The anxious person tends to be full of anxiousness within her, and the person feels as if there is an impending danger. And when you say impending, it means there is an approaching, an incoming source of stress that sometimes lets him feel down and would make him or her feel terrible. Depression, on the other hand, is happens if a person has lost interest in most things that used to excite him or her, experienced drastic changes in appetite, and with persistent feelings of sadness for most of the days, and has much decrease in energy. I think nowadays we hear a lot of people suffering from depression, and this is a serious mental health condition. And however, remember that depression is not something that should take over your life, and this is definitely preventable and curable. According to um, professional psychologist, depression takes a short time for some, and for some people a longer time too. But in terms of the symptoms or the telltale signs, you would see that it's not only the mind that it's affected, but also there are drastic changes or big changes that happen in terms of a person's likelihood or a person's appetite. And when you say persistent feelings, it means it's something that constantly happens to you all day long. And you don't necessarily have the energy to face the day. Now we move on to panic attack. If a person experiences feelings of panic, fear, uneasiness, nervousness, or agitation, and maybe some physiological effects while feeling these, for example, heart palpitations, cold or sweaty feet or hand, shortness of breath, nausea, and dizziness. Now, panic attack is something that is also common among people. And just like anxiety, panic attack um, makes you, does something to your body. And we can see that panic attack, as compared to anxiety, have or has a more obvious way of manifesting. Or in Filipino, nagpapakita ito or mas nafe-feel, mas nakikita natin yung effect niya sa ating katawan. It says here, physiological effects. Kapag ikaw ay nagpa-panic attack, you normally have heart palpitations. Ibig sabihin, mabilis yung tibok ng iyong puso and para kang kinakabahan, yung malamig yung kamay and nagsi-sweat siya, especially yung feet and hand mo, and you have shortness of breath even if you are not doing any physical activity. You also feel a little nauseous, ibig sabihin medyo nahihilo and nasusuka. Okay? Now, going back to Jane's situation earlier, we look at the questions that we can answer in order to process what's happening. First, how do you think the death of Jean's brother affected her whole person? The physiological, cognitive, psychological, social, and spiritual. How is Jean coping with her grief? How do you think is she dealing with her emotions and feelings? And finally, consider Jean's alcohol use and emotional state. Is she using alcohol in an attempt to cope with unresolved grief related to the death of her brother? When we are met with difficult challenges, such as in the case of Jean, we often do not understand how to respond, and oftentimes we lack the mental fortitude or lakas ng loob to face the reality. How should we address this problem then? Of course, we try to solve these problems by being aware of ourselves and by looking ahead of what's in store for us. And of course, this could be very difficult for some, but we have to keep moving forward, just like what people say. To be able to face and deal more effectively with one challenges, it pays to know how one is behaving under the trying circumstance. According to modern psychology, people have shown substantial interest in helping one better understand himself. A more in depth view of knowing oneself is provided by a psychologist by the name Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is an Austrian neurologist who formed the psychoanalytic theory. He proposed that one's mind can be viewed as an energy system which is divided into three levels of awareness: conscious, unconscious, and subconscious. So here, importante na when we meet our life challenges, we are aware of what we're doing and we know what's in store for us. We know what's going to happen. And classic psychology, in fact, has identified ways on how we become more self aware. One of the one of the most notable psychologists who very much dabbled into and explored this area of study is Sigmund Freud, and he said that he's very well known for his theory called psychoanalytic theory. And let's look at how or what these three things are: the conscious, unconscious, and subconscious. The conscious holds the things that we are aware of. It contains the thoughts that one is currently aware of, but deals with only a tiny percentage of all the information stored in one's mind. In other words, yung conscious, ito yung bagay na alam natin na ginagawa natin. Ito yung mga thinking that we do and the actions that we do, the reflections that we do every day that we know we do and we recognize that we're doing it. It says here, and it's very important to note this, that it only constitutes a tiny percentage of all the information that's happening or that's stored in our mind. It means the consciousness, which is one of the levels of awareness, kaunti lang yung alam natin na nag-work that's being processed in our mind. It's only a tiny percentage. Let's look at the subconscious. The subconscious carries the mental elements that are not conscious, but can be aware of if we choose to attend to them. It holds the information that are easily retrievable. Yung subconscious, ito yung medyo hindi tayo aware, but it's there in our mind. It's just in one of the boxes that's na nakasilid sa deep recesses, sa mga corners ng ating mind. Of course, we have dealt so many experiences. We have seen a lot of things, and of course, the mind can only accommodate a few or only a handful of these things that we have already seen. And so it doesn't mean to say that yung mga nakita na natin before or na-experience natin before won't be retrievable. Ibig sabihin ng retrievable, hindi mo na siya maaalala. It's there and it will only become part of the conscious if you choose to remember them. And finally, the unconscious, it bears all of our drives and instincts that are repressed, and therefore they are difficult to retrieve. So unahin muna natin yung mga terms dito. Pag sinabi natin na ang ating iniisip ay repressed, ibig sabihin these are things that we do not entertain in our mind. We try to forget them. We try to deliberately forget them. Ibig sabihin, may mga iniisip tayo na minsan kapag sumagi sa ating utak, we choose not to think more about it, and so they're repressed. Parang they're pushed there in the darkest regions of our minds so that we don't necessarily need to remember them. And the unconscious, actually yung mga bagay na we choose to forget, na kinakalimutan natin, they sometimes manifest. Nagpapakita ito sa ating behavior, sa ating attitudes. And minsan hindi tayo aware na naapektuhan pala nila yung ating pag-iisip or yung mga desisyon natin sa buhay. Okay? So again, the three levels of awareness are the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. Now, the unconscious, for the unconscious, Freud believed that the unconscious holds the vast majority of our thoughts. The materials stored in this level are not easily accessible, and it is responsible for much of one's everyday behavior. Freud believed that the repression of these thoughts, urges, and instincts were meant to protect the individual from feelings of anxiety that would occur if one become conscious of them. Ito, very notable din. It's an interesting thing to look at. Earlier, we said that the consciousness only constitutes a tiny percentage, kaunti lang yung percentage ng awareness na napupunta or that we focus or that we put forth in our consciousness. And sabi ni Freud, he told that the unconsciousness ito yung may pinakamalaking percentage na ng ating consciousness or ng ating awareness na hindi natin we don't easily or we don't necessarily recognize. And according to Faced and Faced, the reason why we don't necessarily remember them is because, yun nga, just like what I said earlier, itong mga ideas, itong mga thoughts na ito, or mga instincts na ito, would make us anxious. And the reason why we forget them, the reason why they are in the unconscious is because it protects us from feelings of anxiety. Okay. One example of this is a bad experience, a particularly bad experience that you had and that you don't want to look back to because it only causes you so much stress. Okay. Now let me show you an example of how the unconscious manifest. Pag sinabi nating manifest, nagpapakita sa ating daily actuations. So here is a picture of an American senator, and in one of his speeches, he said something. And in this example, we see that there are times when one experiences wanting to say something but ends up verbalizing a totally different word. This is what this American senator said: our national interests ought to be encouraged, the breast and the bright. Okay? So instead of saying the best and the bright, Ted Kennedy here um, uttered a different word, which is breast. According to Freud, this is what you call the slip of the tongue or Freudian slip. Freudian slip. Nangyayari sa atin to most of the time. We end up saying something that we don't really we did not really intend to say at the first place, and this is only one of the many ways in which the unconscious slither or finds a way to manifest in our daily lives. To better understand these three levels of mental life, I'd like you to imagine an iceberg. And here you see an example of the iceberg here. The tip represents our conscious, our recognizable thoughts and perceptions. The smallest part, but the most visible. Just below, the surface is our pre-conscious level. Ito yung subconscious na tinatawag natin. Here is where we store our memories when we were when we were children, and we also store here important knowledge that might not be necessary as of the moment. These can be retrievable. In Filipino, pwede natin silang maalala if we choose to remember them. The biggest region, which is buried down into the deep sea, is our unconscious. Ito yun. Katulad ng sinabi ko kanina, it constitutes the biggest part of our mental life. And nandito yung iba-ibang mga bagay na naiisip natin. Usually, yung mga animalistic tendencies. Remember, according to science, we came from or we descended from the animals. And um, of course, as animals, we have animalistic tendencies, such as violent motives, yung fears natin, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, selfish needs, and shameful experiences. Ito yung mga bagay na we don't necessarily like thinking about most of the day and makes us anxious. So we really deliberately sinasadya natin silang kalimutan. But of course, there are times when they slip out of that unconscious level and manifest or nagpapakita sa ating everyday life. But those are, of course, only a few moments. In addition to this, Freud also proposed that human behavior results from the interaction of three provinces of the mind: the it or id, the I or ego, and the final province, the over I or superego. Remember, id, ego, and superego. Here is an illustration so that it's easier to understand. These three provinces are often not at peace with one another, and actually they create conflict, like forces pulling at three corners to form a triangle. The desires of the id, ego, and superego complement and contradict one another. A person with a healthy and mature personality will definitely. What do you think happens to a person with a healthy and mature mind? Here's a question. If we're going to look at a mature and healthy person, a person with a mature and healthy personality, what can you say about the state of his or her id, ego, and superego? So let's take a closer look at these three important provinces of the mind. According to Freud, id refers to the pleasure man. The id operates as the pleasure man, as its main goal is to satisfy one's wants and needs immediately to avoid pain at all cost. This is the structure of personality that is first to develop, as evident by how newborn babies behave. I want it and I want it now. It is the id that tells one to eat ice cream whenever one wants. Being primarily concerned with survival, it ensures all our basic needs are met and is indifferent to the rules and regulations of society. In order to understand this better, I'd like you to think of a metaphor of a picture. I'd like you to think of the id as the baby. So remember when we were very young, when we were babies, our tendencies is we always say to our caregivers, if we want something, then we need to get it. And what babies do when they don't get what they want is they cry, right? And that's a manifestation of the id, just like what it says here. It's pleasure man. Um, it works within us and it wants us to acquire or obtain what we really want, whatever that is. Okay? Kung anong gusto mo, yun ang masusunod. In other words. And this is first to develop because the id usually manifests sa mga babies, just like what I said. And this is very much concerned with survival. So even if it's sometimes bad or not appropriate and it's against the societal norms or rules and regulations, it doesn't care. Okay, gusto niya lang makuha kung anong gusto niya, and it has to be fulfilled. Otherwise, it's upset or disappointed. Now let's go to the ego. The ego is the decision maker. It comes into play and attempts to bring balance by being more realistic. The ego aims to satisfy the id in ways that would not anger the superego. It is based on reality, evaluating whether the id or the superego will win in a particular situation. Once ego figures out how to accommodate both desires, the ego comes up with a decision to eat ice cream only after lunch. So I'd like us to take a look and think about ego as the middleman. Okay? Um, ito yung conscious self, right? And the ego here balances what the id wants and what the superego wants. Kaya siya decision maker. And it looks into a situation more realistically and responds to the situation, responds to um, a particular stimulus based on whether it's good to follow id or it's better to follow superego. There are moments kasi that id can be completely followed because in that situation, probably there are no social rules and regulations, and you're really going to be followed. However, there are more things that we do that needs more thinking, um, that needs more deliberation, and so that is where the superego comes in. For example, earlier we were using the example of eating ice cream. For the id, um, you would eat ice cream whenever, whatever you want, whenever you want it. The ego right here would say to id na, of course, the ego would first evaluate where the person is and what the situation is before acting on what id wants. Now let's go to superego. So the superego functions as the moral man, since its concern is to regulate what should and should not be done. It is also known as the conscience and strives for the ideal principle of perfection at all times. As a child grows, he becomes more aware of social norms and the proper code of conduct. Going back to the ice cream example, while one's id dictates that one gets the ice cream, one's one superego must be provoked to stop one from doing so since it is almost lunchtime. So kanina si Id, in the example of ice cream, gusto niya na kaagad kumain yung tao. But superego here is very much at conflict with in conflict with id. Sabi niya, wag muna kasi it's not the right time for us to eat ice cream. So ang final decision maker here is si ego. Siya yung magsasabi kung pwede bang kumain ng ice cream, kung kailan pwede, so that he is able to accommodate what id what both id and superego wants. And the decision is the person could eat ice cream only after lunch. So by doing that, the id's wants to eat ice cream is fulfilled, and also superego's requirement is also fulfilled. I hope that's clear with you guys. Now let's try to apply what you've learned about id, ego, and superego. Freud's id, ego, and superego are constructs that are very much represented in TV. Characters portray a dominant reflection of each of these constructs. Can you guess which character shows more of each? Let's begin. So here is a photo of a very popular movie, and I definitely think that everyone knows this. So who do you think is the character that best represents id, ego, and superego? Okay, so the title of the film is Harry Potter, and Harry Potter here is the ego. Hermione Granger is superego, and Ron Weasley best represents id. How about this? Of course, the title of the film is Lion King. Young Simba here represents id, Scar represents ego, and Rafiki represents the superego. How about this? I'm not sure if this is a cartoon or an anime. I think it is a cartoon. Of course, this is Phineas and Ferb. Phineas here represents id, Ferb represents ego, and Candice represents superego. How about here? Of course, this is called Lord of the Rings. Gollum represents id, Frodo represents ego, and Sam represents superego. Okay, so I hope that you are able to get all the correct answers, and I hope that the idea of or the concept of id, ego, and superego is clear. Now, if you didn't get the correct answers here, um, you can still definitely have a comeback um, by looking at this case study. Still about ego, id, and superego. Let's look at Diane and her academic plans. Diane is a graduating senior high school student currently feeling confused and lost due to uncertainties about being accepted into the college of her choice. However, her parents find it impractical and has been pushing her to apply for a pre-med or business related course. She mentioned several arguments that she had with her parents while trying to convince them to allow her to study her preferred course. She's currently at a loss under whether to listen to her parents or to pursue her plans of taking up arts. Her current concern is on what approach to take in, or to take in order to convince her parents to let her pursue what she prefers without having a fight with them over it. So, I'd like us to focus on the application of id, ego, and superego in this situation. Here are the guide questions for you. You can pause after the questions so that you can think of answers. How do the constructs id, ego, and superego apply in Diane's situation? How is Diane going to reconcile what she wants and what her parents want? What happens when id, ego, and superego clash with one another? Freud's id, ego, and superego truly come in play in our daily lives. You might be thinking why there are moments when you don't understand yourself. Because you keep on thinking too much, especially when making decisions. These three provinces of our mind truly affect us. As an adolescent, what region or province of your mind usually dominates you? Is it the id, ego, or superego? Now, let's also look at Freud's defense mechanism. If Freud theorized that the mind consists of three provinces, then it becomes a battlefield among the three provinces of the mind. So, to help the ego manage and survive, the ego uses defense mechanisms as a temporary solution. One example of this is denial, and denial refers to when one believes that a threatening experience never took place. So, in the situation of Diane, she might unconsciously deny her conflict with her parents, only to be surprised that she tends to be more critical of them lately. In other words, what she refuses to recognize turns into hidden resentment that she now manifests. With more repressed feelings, she may become more distant from her parents, creating a communication gap. So tama yun. Sometimes when we don't want to really deal with a stressful situation, what we do is we deny them. We deny that this situation happened. We deny that this particular problem exists. And so because we keep on denying that, what happens is it affects the way we behave or our attitude is about a situation. For example, kay Dayan, 'di ba yung parents niya ayaw siya na kumuha ng arts-related course. And if Dayan keeps on denying that that his parents or her parents do not want her to take up pre-med or business course, then she might do so. However, this could definitely lead to other manifestations. For example, siguro mas hindi niya papansin yung parents niya or mas magiging mas may gap, mas magkakaroon ng gap between her parents because there is a problem and she chooses not to uh, face the problem right here. So working at the unconscious level, defense mechanisms are coping strategies that help relieve and protect oneself from unpleasant feelings like fear and guilt. There are various types of defense mechanisms, but the most common ones are the following. Let's begin with repression here. Repression means unknowingly placing an unpleasant memory or thought in the unconscious. Here's an example: not remembering a traumatic incident in which you witnessed a crime. The next one is regression, which means reverting back to immature behavior from an earlier stage of development. Regression, ibig sabihin bumabalik ka doon sa pagiging immature because you can't get something that you want. For example, throwing temper tantrums as an adult when you don't get your way. Very unbecoming of an adult because tantrums are only for kids. Next one is displacement. Displacement refers to redirecting unacceptable feelings from the original source to a safer substitute target. An example of this is taking your anger toward your boss out on your spouse or children by yelling at them and not your boss. So here from the word displacement, your anger is displaced because you're showing this or you're manifesting your anger to people who you feel won't retaliate or won't go against you. So instead of getting mad at your boss, as an example here, you would choose to get angry with other people around you. Next is sublimation. Sublimation refers to replacing socially unacceptable impulses with socially acceptable behavior. One example of this is channeling aggressive drives into playing football or inappropriate sexual desires in art. And we see this most of the time. We see artworks that represents I don't know, we're not sure if it's really a what do you call this, a representation of beauty, or is it just a representation of one's repressed sexual desires or sexual feelings. Meron naman mga ibang football players who are or athletes who have been told na very violent, and they channel this violence through the games that they play. They become very aggressive and they become very violent when playing with others, resulting to physical abuses or becoming too excessive in terms of force. Next is reaction formation, acting in exactly the opposite way to one's unacceptable impulses. One example of this is being overprotective of and lavishing attention on an unwanted child. The next one is projection, and this means attributing one's own unacceptable feelings and thoughts to others and not yourself. For example, accusing your boyfriend of cheating on you because you felt like cheating on him. So when you project your feelings or behavior towards someone, you somehow accuse them of doing something that you think you've done before or you think you'd like doing, so you project it to others. And finally, rationalization, creating false accuses for one's unacceptable feelings, thoughts, or behavior. For example, justifying cheating on an exam by saying that everyone else cheats. These are common defense mechanisms that we normally and naturally do in order to avoid feeling stressed or feeling anxious of the situations that we are in. Now, let's take a more closer look at as to how we should meet challenges that we face in our lives. And we look at Adler's way of meeting challenges. Here is a photo of Adler. In life, Alfred Adler believed that people are motivated to either strive for success or to strive for superiority. He himself was a weak and sickly child who nearly died of pneumonia. In contrast, his older brother Sigmund was healthy and successful in school and business as he grew older. This comparison between the two brothers constantly motivated Alfred to finish his studies and fulfill his childhood dream of being a physician. Even though he experienced hardships in his studies, he was still able to receive a medical degree. As humans, and even when as children, he held that it is normal to feel inferior. These feelings of inferiority motivate one to compensate by striving for success or striving for personal superiority. The integral difference between the two is that striving for personal superiority is unhealthy, in that it aims to achieve a superior position over others. Too much feelings of inferiority or having an inferiority complex may lead people to strive for personal gain. On the other hand, striving for success is healthy since it seeks success for all of humanity. People who are motivated striving for success have high social interest. So one thing that we can see at Adler's short biography here, is that he's able to proceed with his life and he's able to achieve his goal of becoming a physician by comparing himself to his brother. And although it's not a good thing to compare yourself to someone, um, in the case of Adler, this has helped him to better himself. And according to him, he believes that people are poised to developing or striving for success or striving for superiority. Of course, it's very unhealthy to strive for success only to feel superior than others, because the source of your strength, the source of your success is, being always compared to others and wanting to be better than others. A better way to look at success would be striving for it, um, as it is, as success itself within us, because it seeks success for all of humanity. Now, one important thing that is also a key in Adler's theory is that he believed that relating with others and genuinely caring for them makes it possible for all to cooperate with one another for social advancement instead of seeking personal gain. This is what he termed as social interest. Someone who is high in social interest would strive for a goal of success that would include the well being of all people in a community. However, there are people who do not successfully adjust to this. Adler identified two possible factors that lead to this maladjustments: a pampered style of life, a neglected style of life. So, going back again, just to make this clear, Adler also believed in the term social interest. He believes that a person becomes successful or is becomes highly successful if he's able to or she's able to share his success, or he or she is helped to be more successful by um, connecting with others and being more socially interested or being more socially aware and socially connected with other individuals, helping them to also be successful in their own ways. Now, there are people who do not understand or who do not necessarily experience or have difficulties understanding how to connect with others and how to be socially aware. And according to Adler, there are two reasons for why this happens. The first one is a pampered style of life, and the second one is a neglected style of life. Let's look closely at each. A pampered style of life is when pampered people are those always happens to pampered people, and these are people who grew up with parents doing too much for them. Because pampered children feel indulged and spoiled, they develop a pampered style of life, have weak social interest, and expect others to protect them, look after them, satisfy their needs, and above all, believe that they are entitled to be the first in everything. We see this nowadays. There are many adolescents and many adults actually who tend to be very pampered by their family. And so, what happens to them is they have this limited understanding of the world. And because they always feel that their parents would always be there for them and would always satisfy their needs, they don't have to go outside. They don't have to get or they don't need to be interested with others. They don't need to be connected with others because whatever they need is and will always be provided by their parents. On the other hand, children who are neglected and feel unloved or unwanted tend to have low social interest, low self confidence, overestimate difficulties, become suspicious, distrustful, and are unable to cooperate with others. At the other side of the spectrum, we see neglected people or neglected children. And neglected children almost always develop these particular traits right here, especially being distrustful. And because they don't see others as people who can be worthy of their trust, then it's hard for them. It's a struggle for them to connect with others. Now let's also look at Adler's safeguarding techniques. Adler also came up with safeguarding tendencies that protect against anxiety, of which excuses and aggression are two common types. Excuses refer to the most common safeguarding tendency, and this is also or always expressed in the yes but or if only format. Excuses protect a weak but artificially inflated sense of self worth and deceive people into believing that they are more superior than they really are. On the other hand, aggression is used to safeguard a person's exaggerated superiority complex, protecting their fragile self esteem. There are three types of aggression: depreciation, where one might put others down to make oneself better, and accusations, where one might blame another for one's frustrations. Now, let's begin with excuses here. One can become conscious of the excuses one uses, and the key is to recognize excuses that are hindering one's ability to succeed. It helps to take charge of one's own actions and be accountable for each decision one makes. For example, of what we're looking at here, according to Adler, is we use safeguarding techniques to protect us from being anxious, from being accused of something. What we're doing here is parang we safeguard, we protect ourselves from others. And usually there are two ways we do this. First is by making excuses. For example, um, in the uh, in the dialogue of, or when it comes to exercising, you would say, or might say, yes, I would love to exercise, but I have so much homework to do. Or if only my partner was smarter, I would have gotten a better grade. So when we make excuses, we don't really do um, everything that we could do, and we don't usually um, take a step towards being better because we only make excuses. We only keep on our plastering yung mga pagkukulang, um, yung ating mga mistakes, and we attribute these to others. Aggression, on the other hand, we blame others for one's frustration. For example, the only reason she got a better grade than I did is because my teacher likes her more. Or, I wanted to be a writer, but my parents forced me to take up business instead. I hope that's clear with you. Now, anong ibig sabihin ng mga ideas na ito ni Adler? Well, Adler's views just reminds us that although human beings are biological beings, one cannot ignore the strong influence of society and culture. It serves as a reminder that whenever one encounters people that do not treat one nicely, there is an underlying reason for such behavior. Yun nga, totoo yun. 'Di ba, we meet a lot of people from all walks of life. And what Adler's ideas how Adler's help us is by thinking about what he said about safeguarding techniques, by thinking about his idea about striving for success and striving for superiority, about a pampered style of life and a neglected style of life. We have an idea behind our minds on how we should understand others. For example, if we meet someone who obviously has a very low self-esteem and has an inferiority complex. It could be that this is due to someone um, who had a neglected style of life when he was a child, or when someone is having identity crisis, right? Or a difficult childhood that has made him interact in a different way. Whatever it is, at times, one must learn to dig deep within oneself to understand and accept that people have different and unique sociocultural interactions that affect how their personality has developed. That's true. We meet a lot of people, and we sometimes need to understand them because the reason why they're showing this particular attitude or behavior, the reason why they are what they are, is because it's a result of whatever experiences they had before. I hope that's clear with you. Now, we look at expressing one's feelings about others' expectations. Nobody can ever get away from the duties and responsibilities placed on them by others. Whether we like it or not, people have a tendency to hold certain expectations from a person based on the role he or she plays. A mother may expect her son or daughter to be loving and thoughtful. A brother, on the other hand, may expect his or her sibling to be loyal and trustworthy. and a friend may expect one to be honest and dependable. Each person plays different roles in the society because of the many relationships he or she forms. With each role comes a unique set of expectations that are required by someone else. It helps to discuss these expectations and be transparent about which of those one can or cannot be delivered. That way, both sides of the party will be fully aware of the situation, understand and see things from a different perspective, and may help guide or foster improvement. In facing and dealing with one's challenges, it pays to come from a position of more secure inner self knowledge. When one knows oneself, it is easier to discern what is good or not helpful for oneself. Being more grounded inside, one becomes better able to communicate clearly and effectively. In this way of presenting oneself, a natural air of realistic self confidence comes across along with a sense of persuasiveness that communicates to the listener that one truly believes what one says and wishes for the other to also understand that. Learning how to express one's feelings come easily when there is working self-awareness. With all these self-knowledge attained through engaging in the giving self-awareness activities, one can easily flow with how one feels from moment to moment. Such rich spontaneity predispose one to more easily communicate one's needs, thoughts, and feelings to others. One comes across as simply stating facts that tend to invite recognition if not acceptance. Confusions between people are natural, but when one is more self aware, there is a better chance of clarifying what is muddled or straightening out misunderstanding or misinterpretations. So, how should we express our feelings with others' expectations? Just like what I said earlier, because we play different roles in society, people expect different expectations from us. Like for a mother, he would expect or she would expect her sons or daughters to be obedient. At school, your teachers would also expect you to be more respectful and to practice or to be more studious, right? So, when we assume different roles, people are expecting us to also show different attitudes and behaviors. It's always important to communicate and be very clear with the expectations that people have around you because if people keep on expecting things that you might not be able to deliver, then they might have an inflated or or a or their expectations about you can be mismatched with what you could do. So remember to always be transparent, to always communicate what you can or cannot do. But you also have to remember that in order to understand what you can or cannot do, you have to be very self aware. You have to understand yourself. You have to understand what you can or cannot do and communicate that respectfully to others so that they would also respect your thoughts and whatever is being communicated to them because if we always keep our expectations clear and if we keep our expectations transparent, then there are no misunderstandings, there are no miscommunications, and misinterpretations. I think that ends the presentation. I hope that you learned something from today's lecture. If you have any questions, please send me or please ask me on Facebook, and you can also ask me during one of our classes. Thank you so much for coming to the class, and thank you for taking note of the important points that we covered here in our lecture today. Have a great day and see you next time. Goodbye.